was mid-February when the nightmare began. The Alaskan winter had wrapped everything in silence, the kind of cold that sinks into your bones and leaves you feeling hollow. My name is Sarah. I lived in Anchorage, in a small one-story house off a quiet, snow-slicked road. Back then I thought I was safe. I was wrong. It started innocuously, a faint noise, barely audible over the hum of the heater. I was lying on the couch, half asleep, wrapped in a heavy fleece blanket, the kind my mother used to make. It was late, somewhere past midnight. I wasn't expecting anyone. Tap, tap, tap. The sound snapped me out of my haze. It came from the kitchen window. 3 short taps as if someone had just tested the glass. I sat up, the blanket pooling around me. The only light in the room came from the TV flashing muted commercials. My heart began to pound in my chest. Tap, tap, tap. My skin prickled. I told myself it was a tree branch or ice shifting on the roof. I didn't want to look, but something told me, a primal instinct maybe, that I had to. I slid off the couch and crept toward the kitchen, my bare feet pressing into the cold linoleum floor. The window was next to the sink, and as I approached, I swore I saw something. A shadow, fleeting but definite. I stopped breathing. My hand trembled as I flicked the kitchen light on. Nothing. The window looked out into my backyard, a wide expanse of snow bordered by skeletal trees. No footprints, just smooth, undisturbed white. I felt stupid, jumpy. The Alaskan darkness does that to you. I turned off the light and went back to the living room, scolding myself for being paranoid. I curled up on the couch again, pulling the blanket tight. Maybe I drifted off, or maybe I just tried to pretend I could, until I heard the back door, a sharp, metallic click. I bolted upright, my throat closed. Someone was at the door. I grabbed my phone from the coffee table and inched toward the back hallway. My hands shook so badly I could barely hold on to the screen. I pressed my back against the wall and tried to steady my breath. My heart thumped loud enough to drown out everything else. The doorknob rattled once, then again, and then the silence returned, an awful, suffocating silence. I stood there for what felt like hours. My eyes darted from shadow to shadow, expecting something, someone to move. And then I heard the window shatter, from the guest bedroom. My blood turned to ice. The sound ripped through the house, a spray of glass against tile. I didn't think. I ran, down the hallway into my bedroom. I slammed the door and locked it, shoving a heavy dresser against the wood. My breaths came in short, ragged gasps as I fell to my knees, trying to dial 911. 911. The line rang, and rang. 911, what's your emergency? There's someone in my house, I whispered, my voice shaking. They broke in. I don't know who it is. Ma'am, can you confirm your address? I gave it to them as quietly as I could, my hand pressed hard over my mouth to muffle the sound of my breathing. Units are on the way. Stay somewhere safe and stay on the line. I nodded like they could see me. My mind raced. What if they're already inside? I strained to hear anything over the pounding of my pulse, and then I heard the creak of a floorboard, right outside my door. I bit down on my knuckles so hard I tasted blood. The footsteps were slow, deliberate. I could hear the faint crunch of glass under boots. Whoever it was, they weren't in a hurry. My stomach twisted into knots and I felt something cold and wet on my cheek. I was crying. They're outside my room, I whispered into the phone. Please hurry. The operator kept talking, telling me to stay calm. But her voice was distant now, drowned out by the soft scrape of metal against the bedroom door. They have something. A knife, a crowbar. I couldn't tell. I backed up until I hit the far corner of the room, curling into myself, clutching the phone like it could save me. The door handle twisted once, twice. Then the banging began. Boom, boom, boom. Each slam of their shoulder against the wood sent a jolt through my body. The hinges groaned. I knew it wouldn't hold. The last thing I remember before the door splintered was the sound of my own scream. I woke up to sunlight streaming through the bedroom window. It was silent again. My mouth was dry, my head pounding. I blinked, trying to piece together where I was, what had happened. And then it hit me. The shattered door was hanging crooked on its hinges. The dresser had been pushed aside like it weighed nothing. My phone was dead in my hand. I sat up slowly, my entire body aching. My limbs felt heavy, unresponsive, as I forced myself to move. I stepped into the hallway. The house was empty. The back door hung open, snow swirling in on the wind, creating a thin, white path across the floor. I walked toward it, each step slow, hesitant. There were no footprints leading in or out. Nothing was taken. Not the TV, not the laptop, not the cash in the drawer. Whoever had been here didn't want any of that. I sank to the floor, my back against the wall. The police arrived an hour later. I sat there numb as they asked me questions, ones I couldn't answer. No, I didn't see his face. No, I don't know how he got in. No, I don't know why he chose me. The detective, a tall man with tired eyes, stood over me as I recounted everything. I saw his expression shift when I mentioned the taps on the window. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "are you sure it was 3 taps?" I frowned. "Yes, why?" He didn't answer right away. He just looked out the broken back door, his jaw tight. "We've had reports of this before," he said finally. "Same thing. 3 taps. The person, they test the glass to see if you're awake. If you come to the window." He trailed off. "What happens if you go to the window?" I asked, my voice barely audible. The detective's eyes met mine. "You don't want to know. That was 2 years ago. I moved out of Anchorage. I don't live alone anymore, but I still hear it sometimes. Tap, tap, tap. It doesn't matter where I go. I've changed my number, my locks, my entire life. But the taps always come back. My friends say it's just trauma, that my mind is playing tricks on me. But I know better. Somewhere, out there in the dark, he's still watching, waiting, and one night I'll make the mistake of looking again." It's funny how quickly isolation can turn into terror. My name is Aaron Turner, and I always thought of myself as someone who could handle being alone. But that was before the winter I spent in a cabin on Deadwood Lake, a place so remote, it doesn't appear on most maps. I was there to escape. I don't need to tell you what from. We all have our demons. Mine had a name, and it was Greg. After 6 years of hell with him, I packed everything I owned into my car and drove north. A friend of a friend mentioned an empty hunting cabin just outside a forgotten Alaskan town. The place was cheap, far from civilization, and surrounded by endless forests. Perfect for disappearing. The day I arrived, the lake was frozen solid, a flat sheet of gray ice stretching for miles. The cabin sat on its edge like a splinter jutting from the earth. 1 story, single room, barely insulated. Inside, there was a wood stove, an old mattress on the floor, and a single oil lamp. That was all I needed. I told myself I would rebuild my life in silence, far from the chaos. For the first few days, it was peaceful. I chopped wood, read books by the flickering light, and listened to the silence outside. The cold was biting, and at night the wind howled like a wounded animal, rattling the windows. I should have been afraid of bears or wolves, but I wasn't. At least not yet. It started on the 4th night. I was lying on the mattress, drifting in and out of sleep when I heard something. A low thud from outside the cabin. I sat up, my breath clouding in the frigid air. The sound came again. Thud, thud, thud. Slow and deliberate, like someone was pacing through the snow. I grabbed the lantern, lit it with shaking hands, and moved to the window. The light barely reached the edge of the trees. I couldn't see anything but darkness. I tried to convince myself it was just the wind shifting the snow. Thud, thud, thud. It was closer now. I held my breath, my eyes scanning the shadows. Then at the edge of the tree line something moved. I saw the faint outline of a figure, standing still in the snow. My heart froze. It wasn't an animal. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching. I couldn't make out any features, just a tall silhouette against the snow. I turned off the lantern, plunging the room into darkness. I hid under the blankets, my pulse hammering in my ears, and told myself it was a trick of the light. The next morning, I stepped outside to check. My boots crunched through the snow as I approached the place where I'd seen it. There were footprints, large, deep, leading from the woods to a spot just 20 feet from the cabin, and back again. I stared at them, my breath catching in my throat. Someone had been there. I spent the day trying to shake it off, convincing myself it was a hunter or a lost hiker, but I couldn't explain the footprints. They were perfectly straight, like whoever made them had been walking with purpose. I locked the door that night, wedged a chair under the handle, and kept the lantern on. I didn't sleep. At around midnight, I heard it again. Thud, thud, thud. The sound of footsteps in the snow, slow, heavy, closer. I gripped the hatchet I kept beside the bed, my knuckles white. The footsteps stopped just outside the cabin. I held my breath, listening. Then came a new sound, a faint scraping like fingernails running along the wooden walls. My skin crawled. The scraping moved slowly, circling the cabin, stopping at the windows before continuing around the back. I sat frozen, tears streaming down my face as I clutched the hatchet. It lasted for hours, or maybe minutes. I don't know. I lost track of time. Eventually, the sound stopped and dawn crept over the frozen lake. When I finally worked up the courage to look outside, I found more footprints, circling the cabin like a predator testing its prey. I wanted to leave. I should have left. But my car wouldn't start. The engine was frozen solid. I'd have to wait for it to thaw, and by then it would be dark again. I spent the day chopping wood, building a fire so large it filled the cabin with smoke. I didn't want to risk freezing. That night, the footsteps came earlier. I heard them at sunset, circling the cabin faster this time. Whoever it was, whatever it was, didn't care if I heard them now. The scraping came next, more aggressive, as if nails or claws were tearing at the wood. I screamed at the thing outside, my voice cracking with desperation. "Leave me alone!" Silence. Then, a voice. It was faint, muffled, but I heard it. A woman's voice, whispering my name. "Aaron!" I dropped the lantern. The flame sputtered and went out, plunging me into darkness. My heart felt like it would burst from my chest. I stumbled back onto the mattress, clutching the hatchet, my eyes darting to the windows. Something pressed against the glass. A face. It was pale, almost translucent, the skin stretched tight over its bones. The eyes were hollow, black pits that seemed to pull the light out of the room. Its mouth opened slowly, revealing jagged, broken teeth, and it whispered again. "Aaron, let me in." I screamed, swinging the hatchet at the window. The glass shattered, but the thing was gone. I don't remember much after that. Just running into the snow, barefoot and hysterical, until my legs gave out and the cold swallowed me whole. They found me 3 days later, half frozen on the shore of Deadwood Lake. The rescue team said I was lucky to be alive. I didn't feel lucky. The cabin was still there when they searched it. The windows were shattered, the door torn off its hinges. They found footprints too, dozens of them, circling the cabin and leading into the woods. But here's the part that keeps me awake at night. The footprints weren't mine, and they didn't belong to the rescue team. No one has lived on Deadwood Lake since then. People say it's cursed, that the thing in the woods is still out there, waiting for someone to come back. Sometimes, when I wake up in the middle of the night, I hear it again. Thud, thud, thud. Footsteps circling my house, and a voice whispering my name. "Aaron, let me in." December in Anchorage is the kind of cold that seeps into your bones and stays there. The sun barely rises, and when it does, the light is pale, ghostly. I'd always loved it, though. The solitude, the endless white, the way the snow muffles the world until it feels like you're the only person left alive. But that was before the Stalker. My name is Lauren Hayes, and I live alone. It wasn't by choice. My boyfriend Eric left last spring, and I stayed behind in the tiny house we rented together. I told myself I liked the quiet, that I needed time to figure things out. It wasn't until December that I realized someone else was watching. It started with small things. A cigarette butt on the porch. A smudge on the window I couldn't remember making. One night, I found the trash can overturned, its contents spilled across the snow like entrails. I told myself it was raccoons or a hungry bear. I should have been more careful, but back then, I thought I was safe. After all, who would bother stalking a nobody like me? The first real warning came on December 6th. I remember the date because it was my birthday. I came home from work to find a single rose on the porch. No note, no explanation. Just a deep red rose, its petals frozen and brittle in the cold. I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe it was from a neighbor. Maybe someone got the wrong house. But the next morning I found another one. This time, it was on my car windshield. My breath fogged the air as I stood there staring at it. The stem was pressed against the glass, the petals crushed slightly. I looked around, but the street was empty. Just the endless snow, silent and unbroken. By the third rose, I couldn't ignore it anymore. It was inside the house. I'd been in bed trying to sleep when I heard the faint creak of the floorboards. I froze, my heart hammering. I told myself it was the wind or the house settling. But when I got up to check, I found it on the kitchen counter, a fresh red rose, lying there like it belonged. I called the police the next morning. They sent an officer who looked bored and tired, as if I'd dragged him out of bed for a noise complaint. He walked through the house, glanced at the windows, and told me to keep the doors locked. That was it. "It's probably nothing," he said, handing me a card, "but call if anything else happens." Something else did happen. A lot of somethings. Over the next week, the roses kept appearing. On the porch, on the windowsill, even inside my mailbox. Each one seemed fresher than the last, as if they'd been left moments before I found them. I started sleeping with a knife under my pillow. My nerves were frayed, my paranoia growing by the day. I'd jump at every noise, every shadow moving across the snow. Then the notes began. They were scrawled on scraps of paper, written in shaky, uneven handwriting. "You're beautiful when you're scared. I see you. Soon." Each one was left with a rose, always in a place I'd find it. The worst part was that they knew things, details about my life, my routines. One note mentioned the blue sweater I wore to work. Another referenced the book I'd been reading before bed. By December 20th, I was barely holding it together. I hadn't slept in days, and every sound felt like a threat. I'd stopped leaving the house, too terrified to step outside. The police came again, this time taking fingerprints and promising to patrol the area. But deep down, I knew they wouldn't find anything. The stalker was too careful. The night it all came to a head, the power went out. A storm had rolled in, dumping snow so thick I couldn't see past the porch. The house was plunged into darkness, the only light coming from the faint glow of my flashlight. I locked the doors and windows, double-checked the bolts, and sat in the living room with the knife in my lap. Around midnight, I heard the footsteps. They were faint at first, crunching through the snow outside. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. The sound grew louder, moving closer to the house. I gripped the knife so tightly my hand ached, every muscle in my body tense. The footsteps stopped just outside the front door. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice trembling. "I'll call the police." Silence. Then, a knock. Not loud, not forceful, just a single deliberate knock that echoed through the house. I stared at the door, my mind racing. Should I open it? Stay quiet? Run? Before I could decide, the knock came again, followed by a voice. "Lauren," it whispered soft and low. "Let me in," I screamed, stumbling back from the door. The voice laughed, a chilling guttural sound that sent ice down my spine. I ran to the kitchen, my hands shaking as I fumbled for my phone. But when I dialed, the line was dead. The lights flickered back on, and that's when I saw it. A rose, lying on the floor just inside the front door. The door was still locked. I don't remember much after that. The police found me hours later, curled in the corner of the kitchen, clutching the knife. The roses were gone, the notes gone, and there was no sign of anyone outside. They told me it was probably a prank, maybe a neighbor messing with me. But I know better. It's been a year now. I moved to another state, far from Alaska and its endless darkness. But sometimes, when I'm alone, I catch the faintest scent of roses in the air, and I hear the whisper, "Lauren, let me in." It was supposed to be a routine welfare check. That's how these things always start. Mundane. A neighbor calls in about a weird smell, or a light that's been on for too long, and someone like me gets sent out to make sure there's nothing horribly wrong. 99 times out of 100, it's just an old person who forgot to pay the electric bill, or someone who fell asleep with dinner burning on the stove. This wasn't one of those times. My name is Dan Wheeler. I've been a cop in Fairbanks, Alaska for almost 10 years. If you think about Alaska, you're probably picturing beautiful, endless snow and clean air. What people don't know is that darkness comes early and lingers late here. There are whole months when the sun barely exists. Nights are long, shadows stretch forever, and if something screams out in the wilderness, no one's around to hear it. On that particular day, it was late November, cold enough that your breath froze on the way out. Dispatch sent me out to check on a house a few miles outside of town. The caller had reported no movement there for days, said they saw blood on the porch. The house was one of those lonely Alaskan homes, isolated, surrounded by barren forest. No neighbors nearby, no other cars in sight. Just a squat little place with a crooked roof and yellowed windows that stared back at me like dead eyes. I parked my cruiser, boots crunching over ice as I walked up the path. The house felt wrong. When you've been on the force as long as I have, you learn to trust that gut instinct. Something about the place made my skin crawl. Maybe it was the absolute silence around me, like the whole forest was holding its breath. Maybe it was the trail of dark spots leading up to the front door, blood smeared into streaks, fresh enough to still look red against the frost. I knocked hard. "Fairbanks PD, anyone home?" Nothing. I called out again, louder, my voice disappearing into the frozen emptiness. Still nothing. I tried the door handle and it gave way. The smell hit me immediately, a dense, rotting stench that turned my stomach. The kind of smell you never forget no matter how much you try. I pulled my jacket up over my nose and stepped inside. The living room was trashed, furniture overturned, papers scattered like snow. A lamp lay shattered on the ground, its cord stretched taut, and the carpet beneath it was stained black. I called out again, this time quieter, almost like I didn't want to disturb whatever might be lurking inside. Something had happened here. I radioed in to dispatch for backup, but the signal was garbage. "Unit 12, requesting." Static swallowed the rest. I cursed under my breath. Cell service was a joke out here, too. I pulled my flashlight from my belt and moved deeper into the house. My boots squelched on something I didn't want to think about. The kitchen was no better. Dried blood covered the counters. One of the chairs had been knocked onto its side, a jagged leg broken clean off. The refrigerator door was open, buzzing faintly, its insides empty except for a single long knife. It sat there in the center shelf, gleaming clean and out of place as though someone had put it there deliberately. I turned back, and that's when I noticed it. The hallway. It stretched away from the kitchen, ending in a single door at the back of the house. My flashlight beam barely reached it, but I could see something on the walls. Dark streaks dragged along the white paint, like someone had clawed their way through. My heart pounded as I moved toward the door. Every instinct screamed at me to turn around, to get back to my cruiser and wait for backup, but I couldn't. Not when someone could still be in there. Hurt, or worse. The door creaked open. The smell that rolled out was so strong it made my eyes water. My flashlight cut across the room and I stopped breathing. The walls were covered in blood. Symbols I didn't recognize, painted with some kind of frenzied purpose. Jagged spirals. Tall, thin figures. My beam landed on the floor where something lay crumpled against the wall. A man, or what was left of him. His face was gone, just a hollowed-out mess of flesh, frozen in agony. His hands were shredded, fingers stripped to the bone, like he'd tried to claw something. That wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the thing next to him. It wasn't human. I don't know how else to describe it. It looked like someone had tried to build a person out of parts that didn't fit. Arms too long, legs bent at the wrong angles. The skin hung in strips, pale and greasy. And its head, Jesus Christ, its head was wrong. Wide and flat, with a gaping toothless hole where the mouth should have been. It didn't move. I don't even know if it was alive, but I didn't stay to find out. My flashlight slipped from my hand and I bolted. I ran back through that house, my boots slipping in blood and ice, my breath ragged. I didn't care. I just needed to get out. When I burst through the front door, the cold air hit me like a slap. I stumbled to my cruiser, fumbling with my keys, hands shaking so hard I dropped them twice. Finally, I got inside, locked the doors, and grabbed the radio. "Dispatch, this is Unit 12. I was screaming, my voice cracking. "I need backup now." The radio hissed with static. "Please," I whispered. I don't remember much after that, just flashes. The sound of something heavy moving inside the house. A low, wet sound, like breathing but slower. The windows on the house seemed darker somehow, like they were watching me. I sat there for hours, frozen in my seat, too afraid to move. I didn't even notice when the sun went down, and the dark crept in to swallow everything. Eventually, backup arrived. They found me still in my car, pale and shaking. I tried to tell them what happened, but I couldn't find the words. What was I supposed to say? That there was something inside that house that shouldn't exist? That it was still in there waiting? They didn't find the man's body, or the other thing. I took leave after that. I had to. I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that room, the blood, the symbols, the thing in the corner. I started hearing noises at night, scratching at my walls, footsteps in my hallway. My wife said I was just dreaming, that it was all in my head, but I knew better. The final straw came last week. I found something on my porch, a long, jagged knife, sitting there like someone had left it for me. It was clean, gleaming, just like the one in the refrigerator. I don't leave my house anymore. I keep the lights on, the doors locked. I sit in my living room with a gun in my lap, listening to the darkness outside. And I wait, because I know it's coming. I don't know when, I don't know how. But one day it's going to come back for me. Maybe it'll claw its way through my walls, or maybe I'll hear its slow, wet breathing in my hallway. And when it does, I'll be waiting. But I don't think it'll matter. Some things you can't escape. And in Alaska, when the nights are long and the dark comes early, no one can hear you scream. You never think you're being watched until it's too late. My name is Emily Greer, and I used to love winter. There's something about December, the frost on the windows, the lights glowing warmly against the darkness, that always felt comforting. But now, when I think of December, all I feel is cold. The kind that creeps into your bones and stays there. It started 2 weeks before Christmas. I live alone in Anchorage, Alaska, in a small apartment on the edge of town. Most of my neighbors leave for the holidays, so the complex turns quiet. I never minded that before. I liked the solitude. But this year, the quiet felt different. I noticed it for the first time when I came home from work one night. There was a footprint in the snow outside my window. Just one, pressed deep and pointed toward the glass. It was strange, but I didn't think much of it. People wander through the complex all the time. The next morning, I saw more footprints. A trail that led from the parking lot to my window, then back again. My heart sank. I tried to brush it off as someone messing around, but something about the way the tracks circled my apartment made me feel sick, like whoever it was had just been standing there, watching. I told myself to stop overthinking. This is Alaska. There's snow everywhere. It's easy to see things that aren't really there. A few days later, the notes began. The first one was stuck to my front door with a piece of duct tape, a single sheet of lined notebook paper folded neatly. The handwriting was careful and small. "You look pretty when you sleep." My hands shook as I read it. I ran to the window and looked out, but the parking lot was empty. Just the same unbroken snow and the skeletal outline of trees in the distance. I called the building manager, but they shrugged it off. "Probably some teenager pulling a prank," they said. "Happens this time of year." But it wasn't a prank. I knew it wasn't. That night, I pushed a heavy chair in front of my door and double-checked every lock in the apartment. I left the lights on and tried to sleep, but my ears were straining for every sound. At some point, I must have dozed off because I woke up to something soft tapping against my window. I froze. Tap, tap, tap. It was slow and deliberate, like someone drumming their fingers against the glass. My bed faces the window, but I couldn't look. I stayed perfectly still under the covers, every muscle in my body rigid. The tapping stopped, and for a moment, there was nothing. Just silence, and the low hum of my heater. And then, a shadow moved across the wall. Someone was outside, someone tall enough that their silhouette filled the window, even though I live on the second floor. I bit my lip to keep from screaming. "They can't get in. They can't get in." I kept repeating it in my head like a mantra until the shadow disappeared. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The police came the next morning. I showed them the note and pointed to the footprints outside the window, but they couldn't do much. "No real evidence of a crime here," the officer said, handing the note back to me. "We'll add a patrol in the area, but just be vigilant, okay?" Vigilant. Like I hadn't been already. I bought a cheap security camera and installed it in my living room, facing the window. I spent the rest of the day feeling like I was being watched, every sound turning into something sinister. When I checked the camera footage the next morning, I almost dropped my coffee. At 3:17 a.m., a man appeared at my window. He wore a hooded parka, so I couldn't see his face, but his posture. His posture was wrong. He was too still, too stiff. He just stood there, staring through the glass for over an hour, not moving. At one point, he pressed his hand against the window, a pale, spidery hand with dirt under the fingernails, and leaned in close. The camera didn't pick up sound, but I swear I could feel his breath through the screen. Then, just before dawn, he turned and walked back into the trees. I didn't leave my apartment that day. I sat on the floor with my back against the door, a baseball bat in my lap. My phone buzzed a few times, friends wishing me happy holidays, but I ignored it. I couldn't think about anything else. The next night, I woke up to a sound I'll never forget. It was the doorknob turning. Jiggle. Jiggle. I bolted upright, my heart hammering. It was so quiet that the noise echoed through the apartment. I crept toward the door as slowly as I could, bat clenched in both hands. The knob stopped moving, and for a second, I thought maybe I imagined it. Then came the whisper. "Emily." My name, drawn out and soft, like someone speaking to a child. I nearly dropped the bat. Whoever was outside started scratching at the door, their fingernails scraping the wood with a sound that made my teeth hurt. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. All I could do was stand there and listen as they whispered my name again and again like a prayer. And then, just like that, it stopped. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I stayed in the corner of the living room, bat still in hand, waiting for the sound to start again. It never did. The police came back the next day, but they didn't believe me. They looked at me like I was crazy, like I was wasting their time. "Ma'am, there's no sign of forced entry, no evidence of anyone trying to get in. Are you sure it wasn't just a bad dream?" I wanted to scream at them. Instead, I just nodded, my face burning with shame. That night, I packed a bag. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew I couldn't stay. As I grabbed my keys and opened the door, something crinkled under my boot. Another note. "Don't leave. I'll find you." I looked out at the parking lot. The snow was fresh, unbroken, except for a single set of footprints leading from the woods to my front door. The police never caught him. I moved across the country, but I still don't feel safe. Every December I hear things, soft tapping on my window, whispers in the dark. I tell myself it's just the wind, but deep down, I know the truth. He's still watching me, and one day, he'll come back, because some shadows follow you forever. I'll never forget the Christmas I almost didn't make it home. My name is Sarah Daniels. I'm 32 years old, and every December I drive from Seattle to my parents' home in Bozeman, Montana for the holidays. It's a long stretch of highway, surrounded by endless trees and mountains, but I've always loved the solitude. This year, though, the quiet turned sinister. I left after work on December 23rd, hoping to beat the holiday rush. The first few hours of the drive were uneventful. Snow flurries danced across the windshield, and the car's heater hummed steadily. But as I reached a particularly desolate stretch of road, I noticed something in the rearview mirror, a pair of headlights. At first I didn't think much of it. It's not uncommon to see other cars, even in remote areas. But this car stayed close, too close. No matter how much I sped up or slowed down, they matched my pace. My stomach knotted with unease. After about 20 minutes, the car pulled up beside me, just close enough that I could see the driver. He was a man, middle-aged, with a scruffy beard and a baseball cap pulled low. He stared at me, his expression unreadable, before pulling back behind me. That's when the panic set in. I tried to calm myself. Maybe he's just heading the same way, I thought. It's a lonely road, coincidences happen, but deep down I knew this wasn't a coincidence. I decided to test him. At the next exit, I turned off the highway and into a small gas station parking lot. I didn't need gas. I just wanted to see if he'd follow. He did. The car idled at the far edge of the lot, its headlights cutting through the swirling snow. My hands trembled as I pretended to check my phone. I thought about calling someone, but who? And what would I even say? Instead, I got back into my car and merged onto the highway, praying he'd lose interest. He didn't. By now it was close to midnight. The road was pitch black, flanked by towering evergreens that seemed to close in on me. The car behind me edged closer, its headlights glaring in my rearview mirror. My heart pounded as I reached for my phone and dialed 911. 911, what's your emergency? I stammered out my location and told the operator about the car following me. Her voice was calm, but I could hear the urgency beneath it. Stay on the line with me, she said. We're dispatching officers to your area. Keep driving if you can, but if you feel unsafe, find a well-lit area to pull over. A well-lit area. That would have been nice if there were any. All I could see was darkness and snow. Suddenly, the car behind me sped up and swerved into my lane, forcing me to hit the brakes. I screamed as my car skidded on the icy road and came to a halt. Before I could react, the driver's door opened and two men got out, their faces obscured by scarves and hats. One of them yanked my door open. "Out!" he barked, pointing a gun at my head. My body felt like it was moving in slow motion as I unbuckled my seatbelt and stepped into the freezing night. The other man grabbed my arms and pulled me toward their car, where they shoved me into the back seat. My phone slipped from my hand and landed in the snow. They tied my wrists with rough rope and blindfolded me, the coarse fabric cutting into my skin. The smell of sweat and cigarettes filled the car as they drove, their voices low and hurried. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but their tone made it clear. This wasn't random. They knew what they were doing. I don't know how long we drove. Time lost meaning as the car rocked over uneven terrain. My mind raced with worst-case scenarios. Would they kill me? Dump my body in the woods where no one would ever find me? My family wouldn't even know what happened. Tears soaked the blindfold as I whispered a silent prayer. The car finally stopped. They dragged me out and forced me onto the ground, the icy snow biting through my clothes. One of them pressed the barrel of the gun to my temple. "Don't make a sound," he growled. I squeezed my eyes shut, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The other man rifled through my pockets and bag, muttering curses when he didn't find much. They argued in hushed tones, their voices growing more agitated. I barely registered the words until one of them said, "We've got to move. Someone might have seen us." And someone had. The faint wail of sirens pierced the night. The men froze, their panic palpable. "Cops!" One of them hissed, "Let's go!" They shoved me back into the snow and bolted, their footsteps crunching as they disappeared into the woods. Moments later, bright lights flooded the area, and a voice called out, "Police, stay where you are!" Relief washed over me as officers surrounded me, their voices calm but firm. They cut the ropes from my wrists and helped me to my feet. I was shaking so hard I could barely stand. "You're safe now," one of them said, his voice steady. But I wasn't. Not really. The men were never caught. The police found their car abandoned a few miles away, along with some of my belongings. They said it was likely a robbery gone wrong, but I know it was more than that. They were hunting me, and they almost got away with it. I've made the drive to Bozeman every Christmas for years, but I don't think I'll ever do it again. Now, every pair of headlights in my rearview mirror sends a shiver down my spine. Every dark road feels like a trap. Christmas used to mean family, warmth, and safety. Now it's a reminder of how quickly everything can be taken away, because some roads are better left untraveled. I've always loved the quiet of Christmas Eve. Growing up, it was the calm before the excitement of Christmas morning, a night of soft snow, warm lights, and stillness. This year, though, Christmas Eve turned into a nightmare I'll never forget. My name is Hannah Clark. I'm 28, and I live alone in a small house just outside Fairbanks, Alaska. My family is scattered across the country, so I planned a peaceful holiday by myself. A movie marathon, hot cocoa, and maybe a late-night call to my parents. I didn't feel lonely, at least not until the knocking started. It was just after 10 p.m. when I heard it. 3 soft knocks at the front door. Knock, knock, knock. I froze, the remote halfway to my lips. Who would be knocking this late on Christmas Eve? My neighbors had all gone out of town, and no one ever visited unannounced, especially in weather like this. I hesitated, then got up and tiptoed to the door. "Hello?" I called softly, peering through the peephole. No one was there. The porch was empty, just a thin layer of snow disturbed by boot prints leading to the door. My stomach tightened, and I stepped back, locking the deadbolt and chain. "Wind," I whispered to myself. "Maybe kids playing a prank." But deep down, I didn't believe it. I tried to go back to my movie, but I couldn't shake the unease curling in my chest. The boot prints outside my door. They hadn't led back to the street. I shook it off. It was probably nothing. I was halfway through another movie when I heard it again. This time it wasn't a knock. It was a thump. Like something heavy hitting the side of the house. Thump, thump. I muted the TV and listened, my breath caught in my throat. For a moment, there was silence. Then came the unmistakable sound of footsteps crunching in the snow. Slow, deliberate. Someone was walking around the house. I grabbed my phone and crawled to the window, careful not to let my silhouette show against the curtains. I pulled the edge back just enough to peek outside. The figure stood at the edge of the yard, half hidden in the shadows. A tall man, bundled in a heavy coat, his face obscured by a hood. He just stood there, staring at the house, unmoving. I dropped the curtain, my heart slamming against my ribs. I dialed 911 with shaking hands. 911, what's your emergency? Someone's outside my house, I whispered, my voice trembling. He's just standing there, staring. The operator's voice was calm and steady. Can you see his face? No, he's wearing a hood. Please, I'm alone. Stay inside, ma'am. Lock all your doors and windows. Officers are on their way. I hung up and double-checked every lock, even though I'd already done it twice. My fingers were numb, and I couldn't stop shaking. I kept telling myself the police would arrive soon, but every second felt like an hour, and then I heard it. Scratch, scratch, scratch. The sound was coming from the back door. I crept toward the kitchen, my hands trembling. The scratching grew louder, like nails dragging against the wood, until it stopped abruptly. I held my breath, the silence stretching on forever. Then the back doorknob rattled. I stumbled backward, a sob escaping my throat. He was trying to get in. Bang! The door shook violently as he slammed his weight against it. Go away! I screamed, grabbing a kitchen knife from the counter. Bang! Bang! The frame splintered, the lock groaning under the pressure. I ran to the living room, dialing 911 again as I heard the final crack of the door breaking open. "He's inside," I sobbed into the phone. "Please hurry." The operator's voice was firm. "Hide, now." I sprinted to the coat closet and squeezed inside, the knife still clutched in my hand. My breaths were ragged and shallow, my body shaking so hard I thought he'd hear me. I heard his boots on the floor, slow, heavy steps, as he moved through the house. Step, creak, step. The floorboards groaned under his weight as he walked into the living room. I could hear him breathing, deep and steady, as he stopped. For a long time there was nothing but the sound of him standing there, listening. "Hannah," he said softly. My blood ran cold. How did he know my name? "Hannah, I know you're here," he whispered, his voice smooth and deliberate. "Come out, I just want to talk." His boots thudded closer. I bit my lip to keep from crying out, my fingers white around the handle of the knife. The closet door was thin. I knew it wouldn't protect me. I could see his shadow stop just outside the door. And then he grabbed the handle. Before he could pull it open, there was a loud crash from the front of the house, glass shattering, the sound of a struggle. The man outside the closet cursed and turned toward the noise. I heard more footsteps shouting and the unmistakable crack of something heavy striking flesh. "Get away from her!" It was my neighbor, Dave. I burst out of the closet just in time to see Dave, a big man in his 50s, tackle the intruder to the ground. The hooded man snarled, lashing out wildly, but Dave held him down until I saw flashing red and blue lights flood through the broken window. The police stormed in, weapons drawn, and pulled the man off Dave. I collapsed to the floor sobbing as they dragged the intruder, his hood knocked back, revealing a pale, gaunt face and cold, empty eyes, out of the house. The officers said he'd been stalking me for weeks. They found a journal in his coat pocket, filled with notes about me, my schedule, my habits, and even sketches of my house. He'd been watching me for longer than I realized. Dave saved my life that night. He'd seen the man prowling around my property earlier and decided to keep an eye on things. If he hadn't shown up when he did, I don't know what would have happened. I still live in the same house, but Christmas will never feel the same. Every sound, every shadow, every knock on the door makes my heart race. I don't know if I'll ever feel safe again, because sometimes the worst monsters aren't imaginary, they're real, and they're watching. It was supposed to be just another quiet December night. I was curled up on the couch with a blanket, the soft glow of the Christmas tree filling the room. Outside, snowflakes drifted lazily under the streetlights, painting the world in a silent white. I'd always loved this time of year, but that night something felt off. It started with the phone call. My phone buzzed on the coffee table, and I saw my sister's name flash across the screen. Megan lived 3 hours away, in a small town much quieter than mine. She rarely called this late, so I picked up immediately. "Megan? Everything okay?" Her voice trembled. "Rachel, there's someone in my house." My stomach dropped. "What? Are you sure?" I heard footsteps upstairs. I locked myself in the bathroom. He's still here. I can hear him." I shot up from the couch, my heart racing. "Call the police, Megan. Right now." "I did," she whispered. "They said they're on their way, but it'll take a while. Rachel, I'm scared." Her voice cracked on the last word, and I felt a surge of helplessness. I paced the room, trying to think of something, anything, to comfort her. "Stay on the line with me," I said. "Keep talking. Do you still hear him?" She paused. "No, not right now." The sound came then. A soft, deliberate creak from the hallway outside my apartment. I froze. The phone pressed tightly to my ear. "Rachel?" Megan's voice pulled me back. "Are you there?" "Yeah," I said quickly, forcing calm into my tone. "I'm here." But my eyes were locked on the dark hallway beyond the living room. "Rachel, what's wrong?" Megan asked, her voice sharpening with worry. I hesitated. "I think I heard something too." I grabbed the nearest object, a heavy candlestick from the coffee table, and crept toward the hallway. My heart thundered in my chest, each step louder than the last. The air felt heavy, suffocating. I peered around the corner. Nothing. Just the empty hallway, dimly lit by the glow spilling in from the living room. And then I saw it. A piece of paper lying on the floor right in front of my bedroom door. It hadn't been there earlier. I was sure of it. With shaking hands, I bent down and picked it up. The message was scrawled in jagged, uneven letters. I'm here with you. A wave of nausea hit me, and I stumbled back, the note fluttering from my fingers. My mind raced. How had someone gotten in? The locks were secure, the windows were shut. It didn't make sense. Rachel! Megan's voice pulled me back again, frantic now. What's happening? There's someone here, I whispered. My voice barely worked. Megan, I think... Bang. A loud crash from the kitchen cut me off. The phone slipped from my hand as I backed away, my breathing shallow. I clutched the candlestick tighter, my knuckles white. The sound of footsteps followed. Slow, deliberate footsteps, coming closer. I wanted to run, to scream, but my body wouldn't move. I pressed myself against the wall, my eyes darting to the shadows stretching across the floor. The footsteps stopped just outside the living room. Rachel, Megan's voice echoed faintly from the phone lying on the floor. Rachel, are you there? What's going on? The silence was deafening. I could feel someone, something, watching me from just beyond the corner. My grip on the candlestick tightened. And then slowly, a figure stepped into view. It was a man. His face was partially obscured by the shadows, but I could see the glint of his eyes. He was tall, his shoulders hunched, and his clothes were dark and tattered. In his hand, he held a knife. He tilted his head, watching me with an unsettling stillness. My breath hitched, and my vision blurred with tears. Please, I whispered, my voice cracking. Don't hurt me. His lips curled into a smile, a cold, twisted smile that sent a shiver down my spine. And then, he lunged. I swung the candlestick with all my strength, the metal connecting with his arm. He stumbled back, the knife clattering to the floor. I didn't wait to see if he'd recover. I grabbed my phone and bolted for the front door, fumbling with the lock as tears streamed down my face. Behind me, I heard him moving again, his footsteps pounding against the floor. My fingers finally found the deadbolt, and I yanked the door open, sprinting into the snow-covered parking lot. I didn't stop running until I reached the neighbor's porch. I banged on the door, screaming for help. Lights flickered on inside, and moments later, the door opened to reveal a startled older man. There's someone in my apartment, I sobbed. Please, call the police. He ushered me inside and locked the door, his face pale. The police arrived within minutes, their flashing lights illuminating the night. They searched my apartment but found no one. The note was gone, and the knife had disappeared. Megan called me later that night to tell me the police had arrived at her house too. They found signs of forced entry, but no intruder. Like me, she was left with more questions than answers. I moved out of that apartment the next day, but even now, in the safety of my new home, I can't shake the feeling that he's still out there, watching, waiting. Because some nightmares don't end when you wake up, and sometimes the scariest thing is knowing you're not alone. It was 2009. This story really happened. When I think back to that morning, there was nothing to suggest the horror that would follow. Clara was sitting at the kitchen table, the pale winter light filtering through the window. Steam rose from the mug of tea in her hands, and for a moment, she looked so serene. I remember the muffled sound of the wind outside, the forewarning of the storm the news had been talking about. Are you still going on the hike today? I asked. My voice sounded distant, as if I already knew the answer. She smiled, that stubborn smile she inherited from her father. Mom, I'll be fine. I've done this trail plenty of times. Clara always loved winter. Unlike me, who always feared the long, silent days of snowstorms, she found comfort in the relentless white of the landscape, as if the cold warmed her from the inside out. Still, Something about that morning didn't feel right. I hesitated for a second and almost said, "Stay home today." But as always, I stayed silent. She put on her heavy boots and her favorite red coat, a red so vivid it seemed out of place in that monochromatic world. Before leaving, she turned and hugged me. A long, unexpected hug, as if something inside her knew it would be the last. "I love you, Mom." "I love you too, sweetheart. Don't take too long, please." Clara stepped out the door and disappeared into the morning fog. The hours that followed were filled with that oppressive silence that only a winter storm can bring. As the snow began to fall harder, worry settled in my stomach like a knot. I glanced at the clock countless times, tried watching TV to distract myself, but the sound of each gust of wind made me shiver. At 5 p.m., when Clara still hadn't returned, I called her for the first time. The call went straight to voicemail. She must be out of signal, I murmured to myself, trying to convince myself, but every passing minute was a silent scream that something was wrong. By 7 p.m., with the sky darkened and the storm roaring outside, I lost any hope of calming myself. I called the ski station, my voice trembling and urgent. "My daughter hasn't returned from the trail. She left early this morning, alone. Her name is Clara." I can still hear the sound of the blizzard, the muffled echo over the phone, as the man on the other end responded with a calm that felt unbearable. "We'll send a rescue team, ma'am, but it might be difficult in this weather." Those words sounded like a sentence. By the time the rescuers arrived, the storm had already turned the world into an indifferent white wall. They followed Clara's usual trail, but her tracks had disappeared, erased by the snowstorm. The team found only small clues, a broken ski pole, buried in the snow, and a partial impression of boots that didn't go far. But no Clara. I stood at the door, watching the men return one by one, their flashlights creating ghostly halos in the darkness. One of them handed me the ski pole, and in that instant, I felt as if the world had stopped spinning. "She's still out there," I whispered. No one answered. In the days that followed, the house became silent, more silent than ever. The phone rang every hour. Family, friends, volunteers offering help. But deep down, I knew. Something more had happened. It wasn't just the storm. Clara was too careful, too experienced to simply disappear. That's when the letter arrived. A brown envelope addressed to me with no return address. By the time I opened it, my hands were already shaking, as if my body knew before my eyes. The first words were written in fine, almost delicate handwriting. "You didn't pay attention to the signs." I did. The letter continued, describing details no one could possibly know. He knew the exact time Clara used to leave. He described the red coat she was wearing, the poles she carried, even the music she was listening to in her headphones as she walked. And then, the final sentence. "The storm only helped me take her. You'll never find her." The paper fell from my hands, and I felt paralyzed, as if the ground had disappeared beneath my feet. The nights after the letter arrived became torment. The silence, which once had been a balm of tranquility, now hissed in every corner of the house. I found myself staring at the dark windows, as if expecting to see Clara's face reflected outside, amidst the darkness and snow. But all I saw were shadows, some real, others born from my exhaustion. The police came the next day. 2 men with compassionate looks, but empty of answers. One of them held the letter as though it were a bomb about to explode. "We'll investigate the source, ma'am," he said with practiced calm. "But it could be someone playing a prank, some disturbed person." Disturbed. The word echoed in me. I looked at him in disbelief. That letter was real. Who else would know those details? "This isn't a joke. This person saw my daughter. They followed her. They promised they'd do what they could." Nothing more than that. When they left, I took the letter back to the kitchen and sat at the table where Clara had last been. I read every line again, as if I could find something I'd missed. Each word felt like it pierced me. "You didn't pay attention to the signs." What signs? I began remembering moments, small fragments that had once seemed irrelevant. That time, 2 months ago, when Clara said she'd heard footsteps behind her on the trail. She laughed, saying it was probably a squirrel or a deer, but there had been hesitation in her voice, or that other time we found a boot print near our cabin in the fresh snow. A print that didn't belong to either of us. I remember saying, "It must have been some lost tourist." Clara looked at me but didn't respond. Did she know? Did she feel something watching her but chose to ignore it, afraid of seeming paranoid? The truth hit me like a punch to the stomach. My daughter hadn't been alone in those last months. She was hunted. The search efforts continued, but they always came back empty. Helicopters flew over the mountain. Volunteer teams combed through the trails even with the risk of snow. Every day without news was another death for me. One night I couldn't sleep. The wind howled outside, as though something whispered through the walls. I went downstairs to the living room, where the phone sat. I still held on to hope that I'd hear a miracle on the other end of the line. But instead, I saw something that made my heart stop. Pinned to the front door was a new envelope, exactly like the first. I ran to it, my hands trembling. I tore it open, and inside was a single photograph. It was Clara. She was facing away, walking down the trail in her red coat, her fresh footprints in the snow. Further in the background, a dark figure stood out, a blurred silhouette hidden among the trees. He was there, just meters behind her, watching. On the back of the photo, there was a short sentence. "I told you I was close." I dropped the photo as if it burned me. My breath caught and my body began to tremble. I ran to the windows, locking them one by one. I checked the front door's lock. I pulled back the curtains to look outside. But all I saw was the empty white of the snow stretching out like a shroud. "Who are you?" I whispered, though no one could hear me. In that moment, I realized something even worse. The stalker hadn't left. He was still here, watching. Maybe from the forest, maybe from closer. Maybe he was standing right there, looking at me through the darkness. That night was the last time I ever looked out the windows. The days that followed were a blur. The police returned, this time with more questions. I showed them the photo, but they only exchanged glances among themselves. One of them asked if Clara had issues with any ex-boyfriend, any co-worker. I wanted to scream, as if it were her fault, as if she had invited that thing into her life. "It doesn't matter who he is," I said angrily. "He's here. He's still here." They said they'd patrol the area, but I knew it would be useless. His presence was something deeper, more calculated. He knew where we were. He knew how to hurt us. And I knew, deep in my heart, that he wasn't finished. The days turned into weeks and the snow continued to fall relentlessly, like a white veil covering a wound that would never heal. Clara didn't come back, and that man, that thing, that took her was still around. I could feel it. It was an invisible presence like a cold weight on my shoulders. I could no longer sleep, nor eat. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the photo. Clara walking on the trail, the dark figure in the background, the shadow that hunted her. That's when the noises started. In the dead of night, I heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, on the wooden floorboards. First downstairs, then in the hallway on the second floor. The house creaked, and the sound was too faint to be the wind. One night, I woke up with a jolt, convinced someone was inside the house. I grabbed the bedside lamp as if it were a weapon and went down the stairs. Everything was dark, cold. And then, on the front door, I saw it. Someone had left handprints in the fresh snow, pressed against the glass of the window. 5 long, deformed fingers, as if winter itself had touched the house. I ran to lock every door, every window. But I knew it was useless. He was too close. The house wouldn't protect me. I could feel him, watching me, waiting for my sanity to break. The next day, my eldest son, Lucas, came to visit me. He was worried, and I could see in his face that he thought I was losing my mind. "Mom, you need to rest," he said, sitting across from me. His eyes studied my every move, as if searching for a flaw. "This is tearing you apart. The police are handling it." "You don't understand," I shouted, my voice trembling. "He's here. He's still here, Lucas. Don't you see? He took your sister and now he's waiting, waiting for me to break. Lucas looked at me with compassion, but also with that silent fear, like he was staring at someone sick. I'll keep an eye out, Mom. I'll watch the house. He didn't believe me. Nobody did. That night, something changed. I was sitting in the armchair in the living room, holding a cup of tea that had long gone cold, when I heard it. A whisper coming from the window. Not words, just a faint murmur, as if the wind carried a voice that shouldn't exist. Slowly, I turned my head toward the glass. And there he was. A dark silhouette, standing at the edge of the forest, unmoving like a statue. The figure had no face, just a void that seemed to consume me from the inside out. He stood there, staring at me. He wanted me to know he was there, that he had never left. I felt a sob escape. My mind spun. Lucas had to see. He had to believe me. "Lucas," I screamed, running up the stairs. "Lucas, come here, quick." But when I reached his room, the bed was empty. The sheets were still rumpled, but he wasn't there. The window was open, and the wind blew in, carrying snowflakes and the distant sound of something dragging. On the windowsill there was a photo. It was Lucas. He was in the backyard, standing in the same spot where the figure had been minutes earlier. Behind him, almost invisible in the shadow, was him. The photo fell from my hands, and I collapsed onto the floor. My breath came short. My vision pulsed. "No, no," I murmured. In the days that followed, no one found Lucas. Like Clara, he simply vanished. The police came back, the same tired faces, the same empty questions. They didn't believe me. They said I was delusional, that grief had consumed me. Maybe they were right. Now I'm alone in this house. The silence is absolute except for the whispers that sometimes come with the wind. All the windows are locked, all the doors sealed. But I know he's here. He never left. I see him in the shadows of the hallway. I hear his footsteps on the roof at night. He took my children. He took my sanity. And now he waits, just waiting for me to finally surrender to him. I no longer sleep. I no longer eat. I just listen. Sometimes when I look out the window, I see tracks in the snow. They start in the forest and come up to my door, but they never leave. They just stay there, waiting for me to open. And maybe soon, I will. Because now I understand. There's no escaping him. Now I wonder, is any of this even real? The days turned into weeks, and the snow continued to fall relentlessly, like a white veil covering a wound that would never heal. Clara didn't come back, and that man, that thing, that took her was still around. I could feel it. It was an invisible presence, like a cold weight on my shoulders. I could no longer sleep, nor eat. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the photo. Clara walking on the trail, the dark figure in the background, the shadow that hunted her. That's when the noises started. In the dead of night, I heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, on the wooden floorboards. First downstairs, then in the hallway on the second floor. The house creaked, and the sound was too faint to be the wind. One night I woke up with a jolt, convinced someone was inside the house. I grabbed the bedside lamp as if it were a weapon and went down the stairs. Everything was dark, cold, and then, on the front door, I saw it. Someone had left handprints in the fresh snow, pressed against the glass of the window. 5 long, deformed fingers, as if winter itself had touched the house. I ran to lock every door, every window, but I knew it was useless. He was too close. The house wouldn't protect me. I could feel him watching me, waiting for my sanity to break. The next day, my eldest son, Lucas, came to visit me. He was worried, and I could see in his face that he thought I was losing my mind. "Mom, you need to rest," he said, sitting across from me. His eyes studied my every move as if searching for a flaw. "This is tearing you apart. The police are handling it." "You don't understand," I shouted, my voice trembling. "He's here. He's still here, Lucas. Don't you see? He took your sister, and now he's waiting for me to break." Lucas looked at me with compassion, but also with that silent fear, like he was staring at someone sick. "I'll keep an eye out, Mom. I'll watch the house." He didn't believe me. Nobody did. That night, something changed. I was sitting in the armchair in the living room, holding a cup of tea that had long gone cold, when I heard it. A whisper coming from the window. Not words, just a faint murmur, as if the wind carried a voice that shouldn't exist. Slowly, I turned my head toward the glass. And there he was, a dark silhouette, standing at the edge of the forest, unmoving like a statue. The figure had no face, just a void that seemed to consume me from the inside out. He stood there, staring at me. He wanted me to know he was there, that he had never left. I felt a sob escape. My mind spun. Lucas had to see. He had to believe me. "Lucas!" I screamed, running up the stairs. "Lucas, come here! Quick!" But when I reached his room, the bed was empty. The sheets were still rumpled, but he wasn't there. The window was open, and the wind blew in, carrying snowflakes and the distant sound of something dragging. On the windowsill, there was a photo. It was Lucas. He was in the backyard, standing in the same spot where the figure had been minutes earlier. Behind him, almost invisible in the shadow, was him. The photo fell from my hands, and I collapsed onto the floor. My breath came short. My vision pulsed. "No, no," I murmured. In the days that followed, no one found Lucas. Like Clara, he simply vanished. The police came back, the same tired faces, the same empty questions. They didn't believe me. They said I was delusional, that grief had consumed me. Maybe they were right. Now I'm alone in this house. The silence is absolute, except for the whispers that sometimes come with the wind. All the windows are locked, all the doors sealed. But I know he's here. He never left. I see him in the shadows of the hallway. I hear his footsteps on the roof at night. He took my children. He took my sanity. And now he waits, just waiting for me to finally surrender to him. I no longer sleep. I no longer eat. I just listen. Sometimes when I look out the window, I see tracks in the snow. They start in the forest and come up to my door, but they never leave. They just stay there waiting for me to open. And maybe soon, I will. Because now I understand. There's no escaping him. Now I wonder, is any of this even real? When I first moved to the old countryside house, I welcomed the isolation. After my divorce, I wanted distance. Distance from him, from the memories, and from the life I used to have. The house was modest, but surrounded by snow-covered fields and woods that stretched for miles. To me, it felt like a clean slate, quiet and safe. The first time I noticed the footprints, I was sitting by the window with a cup of coffee. It had snowed heavily the night before, leaving a pristine white blanket over everything. But there they were, footprints. They started at the edge of the woods, circled around the house, and stopped directly beneath my bedroom window. I froze, the coffee burning my throat as I swallowed. Must be a hunter, I told myself, or perhaps a neighbor passing through, though I hadn't met anyone in the weeks I'd been here. I tried to shake it off. That night, as I lay in bed, I heard something. A faint, rhythmic sound. Tap, tap, tap. It was soft, like fingers tapping on glass. I held my breath and stared at the window across the room. It was too dark to see, but the sound stopped after a few seconds. I didn't sleep much that night. The footprints came back the next morning, more of them this time. They circled the house twice, stopping at every window and door. My stomach turned as I followed the trail outside, feeling the snow crunch beneath my boots. Probably kids, I muttered, though deep down I knew better. Who would be wandering the fields at night in temperatures cold enough to freeze skin? The next few nights were worse. At first it was the tapping again. Then came faint creaking from the wooden floorboards downstairs. I'd lie in bed, blankets pulled up to my chin, listening to the house breathe around me. By morning, new footprints would appear, closer to the house each time. On the fifth day, I couldn't take it anymore. I dug out an old security camera and set it to monitor the front yard. I told myself it was just for peace of mind. That night, I didn't sleep. Around 3 a.m., I heard it again. The tapping. This time, louder, more deliberate. I gripped the handle of a kitchen knife under my pillow and waited for dawn. The next morning, I replayed the camera footage. At first, nothing. Just snowflakes drifting past the lens. Then I saw him. A figure stepped into view from the woods, slow and deliberate. He walked to the house and stood motionless in front of the bedroom window for over an hour. I couldn't see his face clearly, but the way he stood, his posture, it felt familiar. My stomach twisted into knots. I stopped eating. I stopped sleeping. My days were spent pacing the house, and every shadow I caught in the corner of my eye sent my heart racing. I didn't bother calling the police. The nearest station was an hour away, and what would I even say? That footprints were scaring me? Then, one night, I woke up to an icy draft. My bedroom door was open, swaying slightly as though someone had just passed through it. My heart pounded. I grabbed my flashlight and knife and moved downstairs, my bare feet nearly slipping on the cold wooden floor. In the living room, the front door was ajar. Snow had blown in, leaving a trail of wet, heavy footprints leading inside. My flashlight trembled in my hand as I followed them, through the kitchen, down the hall, and finally to my bedroom closet. I stood there, staring at the door. I couldn't hear anything, but I felt something, a presence. I swallowed hard and flung the closet door open. No one, just a piece of folded paper on the floor. Slowly, I picked it up and unfolded it. My vision blurred as I read the words, written in the unmistakable handwriting of my ex-husband. "You'll never escape me, Sarah." I don't remember much after that. I must have screamed, though no one heard me. I called the police the next morning, but they found nothing. No sign of forced entry, no footprints inside the house. I told them about the note, but it had vanished. They looked at me like I was losing my mind. Maybe I was. I sold the house and moved back to the city. I thought being around people would help, but it didn't. I see him everywhere now. In every shadow, in every face on the street. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night and feel someone watching me. I keep the knife under my pillow. I keep the lights on. But it doesn't matter. He's out there somewhere, and I know he's waiting. He told me I'd never escape him. And deep down, I believe him. I moved into the old countryside house in late January, craving isolation after the divorce. The air was sharp and cold, the fields blanketed in snow that stretched into endless woods. Out here there were no neighbors, no noise, and no memories of him. Just me and the quiet. The first time I noticed the footprints was on a Thursday morning. I was at the kitchen window stirring a mug of coffee when something outside caught my eye, a line of footprints in the snow. They weren't mine. I hadn't left the house in days. The prints started at the tree line, perfectly spaced, and circled the house once before stopping beneath my bedroom window. I felt a strange prickle on my skin, like someone was watching me. Probably a hiker, I muttered aloud, as if hearing my own voice would make it true. Still, the image of someone standing beneath my window, staring up at me, settled uneasily in my mind. That night, the house felt different. Every creak of the wood and whisper of the wind made me jump. Around 2 a.m., I woke to a faint sound. Tap, tap, tap. Soft, deliberate. It was coming from the bedroom window. My breath caught in my throat. I sat up, barely daring to move. I couldn't see anything outside. The darkness was too thick. After a few minutes, the tapping stopped. I told myself it was just the wind. The footprints were back the next morning, more of them this time. They circled the house twice and stopped by each window. Perfect prints, perfectly spaced. It was as though someone had been examining the house. The snow had made everything silent, muffled. I stood outside in my boots, staring at the marks in the snow, feeling suddenly exposed, like an animal caught in the open. Over the next few nights, the disturbances grew worse. I heard floorboards creaking softly downstairs when I was sure I was alone. Once, I found the back door unlocked in the morning, though I remembered locking it. The footprints never stopped. They appeared every night without fail, tracing slow, deliberate paths around the house. By the fifth night, I couldn't take it anymore. I dug out an old security camera I'd brought from the city and set it up in the front yard, pointed directly at my window. "Whoever you are," I whispered to the empty room, "I'll see you." That night, I didn't sleep. I lay in bed staring at the window, clutching the handle of a kitchen knife beneath the covers. Around 3 a.m., the tapping started again. Tap, tap, tap. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I just lay there, eyes wide, counting the seconds until it stopped. At dawn, I forced myself to check the camera footage. My hands shook as I clicked through the night's recording. For the first few hours, nothing. Just snow falling softly in the beam of the camera's light. Then, at 2:47 a.m., a figure stepped into view from the edge of the woods. My stomach dropped. The person moved slowly, deliberately, leaving crisp footprints behind. He walked straight to the house and stopped beneath my window, tilting his head back to look up. Though the image was grainy, I recognized the stance, the way he stood, even the shape of his shoulders. It was him, my ex-husband. I felt like I was going to be sick. I stared at the screen, replaying the moment over and over as dread pooled in my chest. He'd found me. I tried calling the police, but the line was dead. I grabbed my coat and keys, ready to drive to town, but the car wouldn't start. My breath fogged the air as I sat behind the wheel, trembling. I was trapped. That night I barricaded the doors and windows. I pushed furniture against the doors, checked every lock twice. I kept the knife close, my heart pounding with every small sound the house made. At 3 a.m., I woke up again. The air felt different, colder. I sat up, and my stomach dropped. My bedroom door was open. I was sure I'd closed it. I grabbed the flashlight and crept downstairs, knife shaking in my hand. The front door was ajar, a sharp draft blowing snow inside. Footprints, wet, heavy footprints, led from the doorway down the hall, to my bedroom. I followed them back upstairs, my flashlight beam bouncing on the walls. The prints stopped at my bedroom closet. For a moment, I just stood there, frozen. I could hear it, soft breathing, coming from inside. I swallowed hard, raised the knife, and threw the closet door open. There was no one there, but on the floor, neatly placed in the center of the closet, was a piece of folded paper. My hands shook as I opened it. Written in his handwriting were 5 words. "You'll never escape me, Sarah." The police found no evidence. No one had broken in, they said. There were no signs of forced entry, no footprints inside the house. They didn't believe me. I left the countryside the next day. I couldn't stay. But even now, back in the city, I can't escape him. I see his face in every crowd. I hear faint tapping on my windows at night. I wake up to my bedroom door open when I'm sure I'd locked it. I know he's out there somewhere, watching me, waiting. And every time I close my eyes, I hear his voice in my mind, repeating those words like a curse. "You'll never escape me." I don't remember leaving the house. I don't remember the drive back to the city either. It was as if my body went on autopilot, and my mind was somewhere else entirely. I rented a small apartment, a boxy, suffocating thing on the 3rd floor of an old building where the pipes rattled and the neighbors fought through thin walls. I told myself I'd feel safer here, surrounded by people, surrounded by noise. But the noise didn't help. It just made me jump more. Every knock on the wall, every voice in the hall, every sound outside my window sent me spiraling. I triple-checked the locks every night. I lined the door with salt like some absurd superstition. And still, it wasn't enough. It started small. The first time I woke up to find my bedroom window open, though I swore I had shut it before bed. Snow blew in across the sill, a single, thin line of footprints visible on the fire escape outside. My heart pounded in my throat, but I told myself it was nothing. A prank. A coincidence. But then there were the letters. No return address. Just my name, handwritten in ink I knew too well. The first one contained a single word. Soon. The second came a week later. Close. I brought them to the police, shaking with fear. They were polite, but I saw the look in their eyes, pity mixed with doubt. They told me there wasn't much they could do. No threats, they said. It's probably someone messing with you. I wanted to scream. It was a Friday when I reached my breaking point. I'd spent the day hiding in my apartment, curtains drawn tight, lights off. I was too afraid to move, too afraid to breathe. My phone sat beside me, dead. I hadn't charged it for days. I couldn't stand the idea of anyone being able to call me. Around midnight I heard it, tap, tap, tap. At first I thought it was my imagination. The sound was faint, rhythmic, deliberate. Tap, tap, tap. It was coming from the window. My stomach twisted into knots as I crept across the room. I didn't want to look, but something in me had to. I pulled back the curtain just enough to see. There, standing on the fire escape in the snow, was a man. His silhouette was backlit by the streetlights, but I knew. I didn't need to see his face to know who it was. He was looking right at me. I stumbled back, my breath coming in sharp gasps as the tapping started again. Faster now, louder. Bang, bang, bang. I grabbed the knife from the kitchen and ran to the door. My hands fumbled with the locks, but I couldn't get them open. Then everything stopped. The knocking, the tapping, the breathing. The silence was worse. Slowly, I turned back toward the window. It was empty. The fire escape was clear, covered in fresh snow that glowed in the moonlight. And there, written in the snow on the glass, was a single word, traced by a finger from the outside. Mine. I don't know how long I sat on the floor that night shaking. Days? Hours? It didn't matter. I haven't told anyone what happened. Who would believe me? The police think I'm paranoid. My friends think I need therapy. Maybe they're right. I haven't seen him again. Not yet. But I feel him. He's always there, just out of sight, just out of reach. Every time I hear footsteps in the hallway or tapping on the glass, I freeze. Every time I close my eyes, I see him standing there, staring. I know he's not gone. I'll never escape him. And somehow, I think that's exactly what he wants. I didn't want to spend New Year's Eve in New York. Not this year. The city was suffocating. Bright lights, loud crowds, and happy couples everywhere. I wasn't ready for all that cheer. My breakup was still fresh, and honestly, I felt like I was drowning in my own routine. Work, sleep, repeat. So when I saw the listing for a quiet cabin upstate, I didn't think twice. Cozy getaway in the middle of nowhere. Perfect for a peaceful retreat. Exactly what I needed. The drive up was long and monotonous. I left the city early, watching skyscrapers fade into snowy fields and leafless trees. By the time I reached the narrow road that led to the cabin, it was late afternoon. The sun hung low, spilling orange light over everything. The road twisted through dense woods, and for the first time in months I felt calm. The cabin appeared suddenly, tucked into a clearing at the end of the road. It was small but charming. Dark wooden walls, a wraparound porch, and a single chimney puffing faint smoke. The caretaker, an older man named Henry, was waiting for me by his truck. "You're lucky the snow didn't hit harder," he said, as I stepped out of the car. His voice was gruff, and he avoided looking directly at me. "You wouldn't have gotten in otherwise." "It's perfect," I said, forcing a smile. "Exactly what I needed." Henry handed me the keys and gave me a brief tour. The interior was warm and rustic, a stone fireplace in the living room, a small kitchen with mismatched dishes, and a bedroom upstairs. Simple and quiet. Perfect. "Cell service is spotty out here," Henry said as we walked back to the porch. "There's a landline, though, in case of emergencies. Wood stocked for the fire and the heater's working fine. Should be comfortable." "Thank you," I replied, feeling oddly relieved when he finally started his truck. Something about him made me uneasy, though I couldn't quite place it. "Enjoy your solitude," he said before driving off, his tires crunching over the snow. That first evening was everything I'd hoped for. I built a fire, brewed some tea, and curled up with a blanket and a book. Outside, Snow fell steadily, coating the cabin in a soft, white hush. It was the kind of silence you could feel. No cars, no voices, just the crackle of wood burning and the occasional whistle of wind. Around 10 p.m., I stepped outside for some fresh air. The night was pitch black, the forest a shadowy wall around me. My breath misted in the cold as I listened to the quiet. For a moment, I felt like I was the last person on earth. Then, somewhere in the darkness, I heard it. A sound, soft and faint. Crunch, crunch. Footsteps. I froze, my heart jumping into my throat. It could have been an animal, a deer maybe, but as I strained to hear, the sound was too deliberate. 2 steps, then silence. I squinted into the dark, trying to see past the porch light's faint glow. "Hello?" I called, feeling stupid the moment I said it. Of course, no one would answer. The sound stopped. I waited another minute before shaking it off and stepping back inside, locking the door behind me. "It's just your imagination," I told myself. Or maybe a raccoon. But as I climbed into bed an hour later, the sound lingered in my mind. Crunch, crunch. I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of footsteps. This time, they were closer. The sound was unmistakable this time. Footsteps. Slow and heavy, moving just outside the cabin walls. My eyes shot open, and I held my breath, heart thundering in my chest. The clock on the nightstand read 2:47 a.m. The fire downstairs had burned low, and the room was freezing. I sat up, listening intently. For a moment, there was nothing. Just the creaks of the cabin settling and the wind outside. Maybe I imagined it. Sleep-deprived and jumpy, I had been on edge since arriving. But then I heard it again. Crunch, crunch, like someone stepping carefully in the snow. My mind raced. "It's an animal," I told myself, clutching the blanket tightly. "It has to be." But animals didn't move like that. They didn't pause between steps, as if listening. I slid out of bed, wincing as the floorboards groaned beneath me. Grabbing the heavy flashlight I'd seen earlier in the kitchen, I crept down the stairs, every step agonizingly slow. The cabin was dark except for the faint orange glow of the dying fire. Shadows flickered on the walls as I passed. When I reached the front door, I hesitated, my hand hovering over the lock. Do I really want to check? Every instinct screamed at me to stay inside, but the sound was maddening. I had to know. I took a deep breath, unlocked the door, and opened it just a crack. The cold hit me first, sharp and biting. I shined the flashlight out onto the snow-covered clearing. At first, I saw nothing, just the white blanket of snow perfectly undisturbed. Then I turned the beam slightly to the left, and my stomach dropped. Footprints. They started at the edge of the clearing where the forest began, leading toward the cabin. The prints were deep, spaced apart as though whoever made them had been walking slowly. They continued straight to the porch steps, where I was now standing, then stopped. I swung the flashlight around, scanning the trees, but there was no sign of anyone. Just blackness, silent and still. My pulse hammered in my ears. They were here. Someone was here. Shutting the door quickly, I locked it and checked it twice before turning to inspect the windows. All locked. Still, the feeling of exposure prickled at me like needles. Someone had stood out there, watching me. The next morning, I told myself it had all been in my head. Lack of sleep, overactive imagination. When you're alone in the woods, even the most ordinary noises can feel sinister. I went about the morning as normally as I could. Coffee, a fire in the fireplace, a book I couldn't concentrate on. But as the sun rose higher, I knew I had to check again. Maybe the snow would prove me wrong. Maybe the footprints were a trick of the light. Bundling up in my coat and boots, I stepped onto the porch and froze. The footprints were still there. And worse, now I could see them clearly. They didn't just lead up to the cabin. They circled it. The tracks started at the tree line, curved around the back of the cabin, looped around the far side, and ended where I had seen them last night. I crouched to inspect them. The prints were large, boot prints, and fresh enough that the edges were still crisp. Someone had walked around the cabin, watching it from every angle. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. Straightening, I turned to face the forest. The trees stretched out in every direction, their bare limbs swaying faintly in the wind. The woods seemed endless, dark and alive. I couldn't see anyone, but I felt it. Eyes. Somewhere out there, someone was watching me. That evening, I tried to convince myself I was being paranoid. I checked the locks on the doors and windows again, feeling ridiculous but unable to stop myself. For hours, I sat by the fire with the lights on, listening for any sound that didn't belong. By the time night fell, the storm had picked up. Snowflakes whipped against the windows, the wind howling like something alive. It should have been comforting, proof that no one could be out there now. But instead, the sound only made me feel more isolated. Around midnight, I finally crawled into bed, exhausted. The events of the last day swirled in my mind, refusing to let me sleep. I thought about the footprints, the deliberate way they circled the cabin. Why didn't they knock, I wondered. Why didn't they try to come in? It was almost worse. Whoever it was didn't want to be seen. They didn't want anything yet. They just wanted me to know they were out there. I pulled the blanket up to my chin, squeezing my eyes shut. Get some sleep, I told myself. Then in the silence, I heard it again. The footsteps. Inside the house. The footsteps were inside the house. I sat bolt upright in bed, every nerve in my body electrified. For a moment, I thought maybe I'd imagined it. Maybe I'd dreamed the sound. But then I heard it again, soft, deliberate steps. Somewhere downstairs. I gripped the flashlight on the nightstand, hands trembling, and listened. The footsteps stopped, as if whoever, or whatever, it was, knew I was awake. The silence stretched impossibly long, thick enough to choke me. I didn't dare breathe. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run. But where would I go? Outside, a snowstorm raged. There was no one for miles. After a minute that felt like an eternity, I slid out of bed as quietly as I could. The flashlight's beam shook as I aimed it at the bedroom door. My mind raced. What if it's still in the cabin? What if I walk right into it? Slowly, I crept downstairs. The living room was empty. The fire had died completely, the cabin's air frozen and still. I turned in slow circles, scanning every corner. Nothing. Then I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The front door was open, just a crack. Snow had blown in, covering the floor with a thin layer of white powder. I hadn't left it open. I knew I hadn't. I forced myself forward and slammed it shut, turning the lock so hard I nearly broke it. My pulse thundered in my ears as I searched the house, under the bed, in the closets, even behind the curtains. No one was there, no broken windows, no sign of forced entry. And yet, as I stood there in the middle of the cabin, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been inside, that someone was still watching me. The storm continued into the next day. I tried to keep myself busy, reading, making tea, staring blankly into the fire, but I couldn't stop looking out the windows. Every time I glanced outside, I expected to see someone standing there. By afternoon, the snow had eased up enough for me to step out onto the porch. My heart sank the moment I saw the ground. The footprints were back. This time, there were more of them. They crisscrossed the clearing, circling the cabin in chaotic loops. It was as if someone, or something, had been pacing around the house all night, over and over again. I followed them around to the back of the cabin, and that's when I saw it. A small, carved symbol on the back porch railing. It hadn't been there before, a rough, crude shape etched into the wood. It was a pair of eyes. I stumbled back, bile rising in my throat. Whoever this was, they weren't just watching me. They wanted me to know I was being watched. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in the living room with every light in the cabin turned on. The doors and windows were locked, the fire blazing. but none of it felt like enough. Every creak of the wood sent my heart racing. Every shadow seemed to move when I wasn't looking. Around 3 a.m., the power went out. The cabin plunged into darkness. I froze, my flashlight shaking as I switched it on. Outside, the storm howled, shaking the windows. The fire in the fireplace flickered and popped, casting strange shadows across the walls. Then I heard it, the footsteps. They were inside again, just above me, in the attic. My breath came in short gasps as I backed toward the front door. I didn't care about the storm anymore. I just needed to get out. I grabbed my boots and coat, struggling to pull them on, but then I heard a sound that made me stop cold. A slow creaking sound. Someone was coming down the attic stairs. I couldn't move. My flashlight shook violently as I turned it toward the hallway. From where I stood, I couldn't see the attic door, but I could hear the slow, deliberate thud of footsteps descending one step at a time. Creak, thud, creak, thud. My vision blurred as panic clawed at my throat. I wanted to run, but my legs refused to move. My mind screamed at me, "Move, Laura, move!" Then the footsteps stopped. Silence. I stood frozen, staring into the dark hallway. My flashlight flickered, the beam weak and unsteady, and then finally, I saw it. A shadow. A figure standing at the edge of the hallway just out of the light. I couldn't see its face, only the outline of a tall, thin body. It didn't move. It just stood there, watching me. I stumbled backward, a whimper escaping my lips. "What do you want?" I choked out. The figure didn't answer. Slowly, it tilted its head, like it was curious, like it was studying me. Then, without a sound, it stepped back into the darkness and disappeared. I don't remember much after that. I think I ran out into the storm. I remember snow in my boots, freezing air burning my lungs, the sting of branches whipping against my face as I stumbled through the woods. I don't know how long I ran before I saw headlights cutting through the dark. The hunters found me at the edge of the forest, half frozen and hysterical. I couldn't explain what had happened. I didn't even try. I'm back in New York now, but I don't feel safe. Not anymore. I keep my windows locked, my curtains drawn, but it doesn't help. Because sometimes late at night I hear footsteps in the hallway. Sometimes I see footprints in the snow outside my apartment window, and sometimes I wake up to the feeling of eyes on me, watching from the dark, whoever it was. They let me leave, but I know they'll be back.